Welcome to this edition of Sound Off Extra here on the official YouTube channel for the Solomonster Sounds Off Wrestling Podcast, which you can listen to each and every Sunday on the Solomonster.com, Stitcher Radio, TuneIn Radio, and iTunes. I am the Solomonster. It is Tuesday, December 2nd, 2014, and this episode of Sound Off Extra will be dedicated to a rundown of the Stone Cold Steve Austin podcast with Vince McMahon, which aired last night on the WWE Network immediately after Monday Night Raw. Now, let me preface this by saying that if you've never heard a full episode of the Sound Off before, or if you have and maybe you're not caught up, go back here on the YouTube channel, because what I did a few days ago was I usually don't post the full episodes of the podcast to the YouTube channel. I usually save that for iTunes and Stitcher and all that. But I posted a full episode. Episode 356 was entirely devoted to the CM Punk interview on Colt Cabana's Art of Wrestling podcast, where he finally broke his silence on Thanksgiving Day. Spent over an hour talking about all the key points in that interview and just, some thoughts on that. And that's important to listen to, I think, even before we get into this, because a big part of the discussion on this podcast, as it turned out, was CM Punk and Vince's reaction to his gripes coming out of that Colt Cabana interview. So you might want to go back on the YouTube channel and listen to episode 356 first. That's entirely up to you. And also make sure you hit the subscribe button on this channel so when new videos go up, you will be alerted. This was the closest thing to a Vince McMahon shoot interview that we will ever see. Or a book, because I don't think he's ever going to write a book. This was about as good as it will probably get, and I love the hell out of it. Even if he was full of shit on some stuff, which was to be expected. In other parts I felt that Vince was actually being very honest. And that wasn't always a good thing, as we'll see going through this here in a second. But kudos to Steve Austin. I thought he did a hell of a job with this. He didn't hold back. He asked Vince about a lot of taboo subjects that other people wouldn't dare bring up. CM Punk, Randy Savage, Shane McMahon, Jim Ross, too many writers, not enough roster depth. I mean, it was fascinating to watch something like this air live and unedited on their own network. Honestly, the quickest hour and 15 minutes of WWE television I probably ever watched, to be honest with you. And this was exactly the sort of thing we need to see more of on this network if they want to bring in new subscribers. I was happy they didn't dwell too much on the Attitude Era. That was one of my fears going into this. They built this whole thing around Austin versus McMahon. I figured, here we go. 30 minutes of the hour is going to be devoted to talking about the Attitude Era and Austin versus McMahon, which, we see ad nauseum on this network. I mean, there's so much coverage and content already and documentaries about the Attitude Era. It's like enough. And it wasn't bad at all. They did touch on it a little bit later on in the interview, but it was a very small part of the overall interview. You can only talk about the Attitude Era so many times. People want current stuff, just not the current product, if that makes any sense. They need to improve the product first, but it's stuff like this that would keep people coming back to the network. I really believe that. As a network subscriber myself, that's what I think most people are probably buying this network for. Now, I'm a big fan of the classic content, but I'm willing to bet the majority of the people subscribing to this network are not sitting, around watching 1992 pay-per-views and old Saturday Night Main Event shows. Give them something like this, and this will have an appeal to them. So I really hope we see more of this in the future. And, the way I look at it, it's the perfect way to keep Steve Austin connected to the company and keep him doing something relevant if he's not going to wrestle. And he's a good interviewer. I said that on the Sound Off a long time ago. What I like about his interview style, and we saw it here with Vince several times, is that he follows up on things. Too many times you'll hear interviews, other podcasts where people get interviewed and they give a wishy-washy or a bullshit answer, and you're dying for them to ask a follow-up question, and they don't go there. Either they don't think of it, they're too afraid. I mean, we see this in TV news all the time. Forget wrestling and forget podcasts. We see this on CNN and actual news programs where you're just begging for the person to ask a follow-up and they don't do it. And it's a missed opportunity. There were a few of those here, but Austin is actually really good with that kind of thing. Jericho does too on his podcast, but I just think Austin has a knack for getting the most out of the people he talks to. He's very good. So with all that out of the way, let's just dive into not every single thing they talked about here. I took some notes as I listened. I was tweeting about it, at Solomonster on Twitter last night. Let's just dive into the most interesting stuff. We'll start from the beginning and we'll go through this in the order they discussed it. Right off the bat, Austin asks, how's the network doing? Because there's been a lot of mostly negative stories, frankly, about how this network has been performing. And sure enough, Vince says, well, the network's going great from a content and a subscription standpoint. He says they have a 97% satisfaction rate for the network. I would love to know how they came to that number, given all the subscribers they've lost up to this point. It may just be it may be a totally legit number for existing subscribers, but I would just love to know how they got to it. On the network in the UK, which was a big black eye for them a few weeks ago, and I have a lot of people in the UK who listen to my podcast very, very pissed off at how that whole thing was handled. Pulling the network 20 minutes before launch, not really giving any answers as far as what happened. I mean, I think that more than anything else is what's really been very aggravating to a lot of people, in the UK, is that there's been no real answer. There's been no light shed on what happened and when the network is actually going to come to fruition. So he brought it up, and Vince, according to Vince McMahon, he says that it's been a start and stop thing. No shit. They hope to have something to announce by the first of the year. But he makes no promises. So to all the UK fans out there, most likely you're not getting the network for a while. That doesn't sound to me like on January 1st, 2015, the network is going to launch. The hope is they'll have some kind of deal reached or some kind of announcement to make by then, but even that doesn't sound very hopeful right now. He didn't really share any details either about what the holdup is, so still in the dark on that. He said that what we do in WWE is not pro wrestling. Vince said in response to Austin's question about how in tune he is right now with the fans. He says, we do sports entertainment. One thing that was very clear from listening to him throughout this interview, not just on this question, Vince clearly is not a fan of the word wrestling. And we've heard this before. It's always been rumored. Wrestling's a dirty word to him. I mean, it really isn't much of a rumor. I mean, just look at the buzzwords on television. You're not allowed to say this. You're not allowed to say that. And it was very, very obvious listening to him. Every time Austin would say the word wrestling, because Austin kept using it, and he had to keep correcting himself, which is so stupid that he would even have to do that. But he was getting frustrated after a while. He's like, it's wrestling. That's what it is. And Vince said, no, it's entertainment. It's sports entertainment. So Austin said he'd like to see more focus on the in-ring stuff. He wanted more wrestling. He said sometimes the opening segment of Raw goes way too long, like it did last night. What an appropriate week for him to bring that up after one of the more pointless opening segments and a waste of 15 minutes that I've ever seen on last night's Raw show. Vince said, you've got to give the audience a hook or they're not going to care about the matches. My question to that is, what exactly was the hook for last night's main event? I would like to know. Didn't seem like there was one to me. It was just another meaningless 6-man tag team match that they slapped together. It was real, and unlike Survivor Series, which did have a hook, there was nothing on the line in this match. So I don't know what he was talking about there. I was happy to hear Austin bring this up, though, because it's one of the many problems with the 3-hour format of Raw. And they could change if they wanted to. I mean, 3 hours is here to stay. They get paid a lot of money for that third hour. The network wants it. I get it. They're kind of stuck. I would like to think that if it was their choice, Vince McMahon would not have 3 hours every single Monday night. He would cut that back down to 2. Probably cut it back down to 90 minutes, to be honest with you. So they're kind of stuck in this situation, but you know what? It is what you make of it. You've got 3 hours. You've got to come up with the best way to make use of those 3 hours in terms of how you format the show. And, it's just such a tired format, and it's so obvious when you watch these shows. They're stalling for time, and they're dragging stuff out. There's really no need for that. With all the guys they have on the roster, with all the guys that are just chomping at the bit down in NXT, waiting to get a chance, waiting to get a storyline or something going. We don't need 25-minute pointless segments that drag on with John Cena to open the show or the Authority every single week. So that's just one of the many issues with Raw. And it just makes for bad TV. At the end of the day, it makes for mad TV. That's what Raw is these days, mad TV. It's maddening to watch. Austin brought up the lack of competition. and the fact that there really are no other places to go make big money in pro wrestling. He name-dropped TNA, which he did more than once during the interview. He said, all due respect to TNA, they're not real competition to WWE. And they're not, and they never will be. And I like TNA. I watch it. I review it on my podcast. A lot of people don't anymore. But he's right. They're not real competition to WWE. He said the wrestlers are afraid to piss anybody off. They walk around all the time like they're on eggshells, to which Vince said, well, then don't piss anybody off. That was his answer. Don't piss anybody off. And he's right. Hey, don't piss anybody off. He makes it sound so simple. He says the locker room these days is different from Austin's day in the Attitude Era in that there's not as much camaraderie, there's not as much laughter and fun as there used to be. I wonder why. That's what happens in a corporate environment. I'm not saying it's, better or worse. They seem to be making quite a bit of money these days. It's how it is. And then, and this was unbelievable to me, Vince basically went on to bury the entire roster. And I don't use that word lightly because that's one of the most overused words on the internet when it comes to wrestling. Buried. He buried him. They were buried. A guy loses one match on TV. Buried. So I go out of my way not to abuse that word, but I'm going to use it here because that's basically what he did. Without even realizing it, he buried the entire roster. He put down an entire generation of people. The millennials, of which I am part. Okay? So generally speaking, if you were born between the years of 1980 and 2000, you are considered a millennial. But there really is no hard and fast definition of what a millennial is. Anyway, he said one reason for the different locker room climates is that these millennials are not as ambitious as previous generations. So he called his own roster, in effect, a bunch of slackers. I would love to know what some of those guys must be thinking right now. I would love to know what these wrestlers thought when they first heard him say that. And if they know better, and hopefully they do, they'll keep it to themselves. Because after all, we wouldn't want to piss anybody off, now would we? The mixed messages here are frustrating to me as a fan. I'm just a fan watching this stuff. It's frustrating to me as a fan. I can't imagine what those guys must be thinking. If you work for the company, if you're a guy in your mid-20s, late 20s, and you're, in the mid-car, you're trying to make a name for yourself, you're trying to work your way up the car, night in and night out, and you hear this stuff, what must you be thinking right now? In one breath, you hear, well, don't piss anybody off. And then in the next breath, well, these guys aren't like you, Steve. They don't challenge the system. They're afraid to speak up. I don't know. I mean, look, maybe Vince really does feel that way. Jericho talks in his new book about his relationship with Vince, which is fascinating to read. It's a very interesting relationship, and how to pick your battles with the guy. But he likes it when you speak up. That's one thing that Jericho does say. Maybe it's not Vince so much as it's the people around him. Maybe it's Triple H. If the rumors are to be believed, Vince was, he was upset by the Punk interview, but Triple H was absolutely livid. He wanted to kill CM Punk. And to be in that position and hold grudges, probably not the best thing for business. So maybe Vince honestly believes that. I don't know. But I could not believe that when he said that. The whole millennials thing, and they're not ambitious, and they're not like you, just the whole thing, I couldn't believe it. What a stupid fucking thing to say. Just disrespected the entire roster. But then it gets better. He said the last guy to reach for the brass ring and take a shot every time he used that phrase. That's a notorious Vince McMahonism right there. The brass ring. CM Punk even incorporated into his pipe bomb promo about Vince McMahon's imaginary brass rings. Vince said the last person to reach for it was John Cena. Now think about that, because John Cena came up in 2002. According to him, as far as he can recollect, the last guy to reach for the brass ring was John Cena. What was that, 12 years ago? None of the current roster has reached for the brass ring. I guess Punk's problem was he never reached high enough. I guess Daniel Bryan never reached for that brass ring either. The fans handed it to him through no effort of his own. He just lucked into it. Again, how must this make the wrestlers feel when they hear this? Vince mentioned Dean Ambrose. He mentioned Seth Rollins, Roman Reigns by name. He mentioned Bray Wyatt as guys who have potential, who seem like they want it, but they're not quite there yet. He admitted the roster is thin right now, which anybody with two functioning eyeballs can see. And he wants to see these guys do well. He does. He wants to see them do well, but they're not quite there yet. Then he gets to Cesaro. Anybody who listens to my podcast knows I count myself as a fan of Cesaro's. I'm not saying that Cesaro should be the WWE champion tomorrow. Who knows? Maybe one day he will be. Do I see Cesaro at this moment as a WWE champion? No, I don't. But I am a fan of his work, and I think he is much, 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 much better than he is being treated right now. So I was very interested when Austin brought this up, and I'm not shocked because if you listen to Austin's podcast, he's a big fan of Cesaro's. He's a big fan of his work. Not hard to see why. This is what Vince McMahon said about Cesaro. He said he's not connecting yet, and we hope he will. He doesn't quite have the charisma. He doesn't quite have the verbal skills. And maybe it's because he's Swiss. I don't know, but those are the big things that he's lacking. The audience needs to care about you. They need to be able to feel your presence. You need to be able to project that. He's an extraordinary physical talent. Hopefully he'll get it, but at the moment, he lacks it. That may have been the most depressing thing I heard all night. He has no charisma. Maybe he hasn't connected because he's Swiss. I don't know. Maybe I'm crazy. Seemed like he was getting over just fine around WrestleMania time. People started cheering for him organically, getting behind him. It doesn't take much. He's a strong guy. He goes out there. He's throwing people around. He's delivering uppercuts in midair. The people started to get behind him. He got over the big swing. Then he body slammed Big Show out of the ring at WrestleMania to win the Andre the Giant Battle Royal. And then they linked him up with Paul Heyman the very next night. Remember? And the place went nuts. I should know. I was there. People were going crazy. The guy was well on his way. And then, as Austin pointed out, he said it looked like all of the guy's momentum was lost based on the way he was booked after they linked him up with Paul Heyman. Which is true. And Vince had no answer for this. I don't have all the answers, he said. The problem is, it was him who caused the momentum to stall. Everything runs through Vince McMahon. So at the end of the day, the blame lies with him. If this guy was getting over and the people were behind him, and you're responsible for the creative direction of your company and the creative direction of his character, and all of a sudden the guy's momentum hits a wall and stalls, you're going to wash your hands of the whole thing and say, well, I don't know why that happened. I don't know why all of a sudden he's not over. And then they took his biggest move away, the swing. I mean, they dropped the ball on this guy so much. I don't blame Cesaro for that at all. I mean, are his mic skills lacking? Okay, as a fan, I watch him, the presentation of him, his interviews. Maybe he is lacking in that department. I'll give you that. It's not his strongest suit. But by no means is he a terrible promo. He just needs more opportunities to talk. And I think he'll be fine. They never give the guy a chance to talk on television. They never give him a chance to talk at all unless it's on the JBL and Cole show on YouTube. Which is great. It's a fun watch. But it's a 4-fucking-minute YouTube video. How do you expect the guy to get better at these things if you're not giving him a chance to speak? He's already got these other things going for him. It's not like this generic guy you just plucked out of developmental or plucked off the indies, and it's like, well, he doesn't really have a lot going for him, but let's just put him out there anyway and see if he gets better. He already had stuff going for him. All you had to do is give him some more time to speak. Put a microphone in his hand. Come up with some ideas. Give him a chance. I mean, they put Paul Heyman with him. I thought that would be a good move. I figured, okay, because talking is not his strong suit, Paul Heyman is maybe the best talker in the company, one of the best talkers in the history of wrestling. Can't hurt to take a guy like Cesaro and put him with Heyman. Heyman used to do that all the time in ECW. He would take a guy who couldn't fucking do anything and make him look like a superstar. But it's not even that. He has no charisma. He has no charisma stuff. That drives me fucking insane. He has plenty of charisma. For the final time. Just let the guy show it. I mean, I know I sound like a broken record on the stuff with the U.S. title. I've talked about this on my show before. He was the United States champion. Go back a couple of years. Go watch the skits if they're still up on YouTube. Again, we go to YouTube. The guy's a YouTube sensation because they won't give him a chance on TV. Go back and find the skits he did when he would interview people, whatever city they were in for that show, okay? He would, like, man on the street type stuff, jaywalking, okay, on the Tonight Show, the segment he used to do. He was hilarious. He would put down people, he would insult them, he would insult their city, their town, whatever. It was great. He was funny. He showed charisma. The 2K15 roster reveal that aired on this very network, that this aired on, plenty of charisma. He's got a quick wit about him. To say that he has no charisma is just, it's a lie. And the reason this was so depressing is because it just confirmed all of the internet rumors going back months about what they thought of Cesaro. I figured it was true. I didn't doubt it. But to hear it from Vince's mouth, it just drove it home. And I believe now more than ever that Cesaro's future is probably in a place like New Japan Pro Wrestling. He'd be a great fit there for that style instead of being just wasted away here. Because it's obvious they have no idea what to do with him. And that sucks. But that's what I got out of this. And Vince, of course, well, I want to see him succeed. Hopefully he'll find it and he'll do well. Look, I hope so too. But after listening to what this guy had to say, I don't have high hopes. Then we got to creative. And back in the day, Austin pointed out it used to be Vince McMahon and Pat Patterson. Pat Patterson was his right-hand guy, his lieutenant. They would get together in Vince's house and they would plan out the storylines for months to come. Then years later, the Attitude Era, post-Attitude Era, maybe there was like a handful of writers now that were doing creative stuff. Now it's an army of writers. 20 or 30 different writers they have. And Austin said, how did this process become so complicated? And Vince says that after Austin left, the company continued to grow and to evolve. If by grow and evolve he means ratings and business decrease, then yes, they evolved. Even if they're making more money now because of international deals and other revenue streams opening up, I mean, the company is a lot bigger than it was 10, 15 years ago. Absolutely. What does the creative process, though, have to do with all of that other stuff? At the end of the day, there are fewer people watching the product now than there were when Austin was wrestling. So, explain to me, again, how does the creative process have any sort of impact on all that other stuff? Didn't quite answer that question. Vince says, can't do it all by myself, so we need these writers. And then he talked about playing ribs on people, pushing them into the pool at his house. He did it once to Dusty Rhodes, to Nick Bockwinkel. Footage of this must exist somewhere. I must see this footage immediately. I can just imagine Dusty Rhodes being pushed into the pool and this giant tidal wave just whooshing over everybody. He shared a story about Shane pushing him into the pool once. Speaking of Shane McMahon, Austin did not waste any time. He said, where's Shane? Just like that. And Vince said Shane is doing well. He said Shane is in Japan. Pretty sure he meant China. He said Shane's departure was a mutual thing. Being in a family business is very difficult. And that may well be true, but I would imagine working for Vince McMahon is probably way more difficult. He told a story about an announcer for his father's promotion holding him up for more money right before a TV taping back in the 70s, and then he walked out, and that's when Vince Sr. made Vince Jr. an announcer for the first time. And then we got to CM Punk. Now, this was a big question going into the podcast. Would Vince address the CM Punk situation? I said beforehand, there's no way he can't not address the CM Punk situation, because if they want this interview to be this no holds barred, there's no restrictions, I'm going to ask anything. First of all, it would make Austin look like a pansy if he's taking fan questions and doesn't ask about CM Punk. That's number one. Number two, it goes to what I said earlier. I mean, this is the kind of thing you need to put on the network. Pull no punches. This is what people want to see. Give the people what they want to see. Punk did the interview. It was the talk of the internet, right? It broke the internet. People are still talking about it all these days later. You can't ignore it. It's the 800-pound elephant in the room with the Pepsi tattoo. So he asked him, do you want to talk about CM Punk? And Vince said, basically not really, but he did go on to apologize to Punk for sending his termination papers to him on his wedding day. He claimed that was not intended. That's what he said. And in other news, I have a bridge in Brooklyn I'm selling on Craigslist right now. He chalked it up to a miscommunication between their legal department and their talent relations department. Here's why I call BS on this. When he says talent relations department, he means Triple H. It's right there on the WWE corporate site. Triple H is the executive vice president of talent, live events, and creative. He oversees the talent relations department. He is the talent relations department. It's not Jim Ross anymore. It's not John Laurinaitis. I don't know what that Mark Carrano guy is doing, but it's Triple H. And Punk even said that Triple H called him or texted him, I forget which, 2 days before his wedding. And Punk told him, hey, I'm getting married in 2 days and then I'm going on my honeymoon. Let's talk when I get back. And I think he said Triple H never texted him back or whatever. And then lo and behold, 2 days later, he gets these termination papers FedExed to him. Now, maybe Vince didn't know. Maybe. I find that hard to believe, but maybe. But Triple H knew exactly when Punk was getting married. So, miscommunication my ass. But it's mighty big of Vince to take responsibility for it himself and to apologize, which is what he did. He was the bigger man. He says he hasn't listened to the podcast with Punk, but he heard he used a number of expletives. That's an understatement. He said he doesn't want to wash dirty laundry in public, but he hopes that one day he and Punk can do business again. He's had issues before with guys like Austin, Hogan, Warrior. He didn't mention Bret Hart, but that would be another big name. And Bruno. He was able to work with all of them again, and he hopes that he can do the same with CM Punk. Austin, I thought, by the way, was great here. He snuck in a mention for The Art of Wrestling with Colt Cabana. Actually, name-dropped Colt's podcast here and plugged it. He paid him a compliment. He said it's actually a really entertaining podcast. I'm sure that just thrilled WWE to no end. Then Austin talked about his own walkout back in 2002. He was asked to put over Brock Lesnar on an episode of Raw. He did not like the creative they had for him, and so he walked out. He calls it the biggest mistake of his professional career. Lost a lot of money because of that. He said Jim Ross was the conduit to get Austin and Vince back together in a room talking again many months later. And when he came back, Austin said that Vince wanted to fine him $650,000 for walking out. And Steve suggested, how about $250,000? And Vince agreed. He said he never shared that story with anybody before. He asked Vince, is there anybody like a Jim Ross who could bridge the gap between him and CM Punk right now? The way that he did with Austin and Vince back in the day. And Vince says no. Punk is pretty much a loner. There is nobody who can play the Jim Ross role in this situation. The funny thing about that is the person would be Triple H, given that he's now in the role that JR used to be in, and Vince never mentioned Triple H. He just said, no, that person doesn't exist. So I don't know what that means. Vince says that he is actually very shy and introverted in private settings, like at a party. He said when Linda used to have her political fundraisers, Vince wouldn't feel comfortable hobnobbing with the other guests. He would be more comfortable striking up a conversation with the bartender. That's my kind of people, he said. I would pay $19.99 a month to watch Vince McMahon in therapy with Dr. Melfi from The Sopranos. Just, on the couch, in the chair, just talking about life, talking about, his psyche. It would be more entertaining than any television show they could ever script. The Undertaker came up in the conversation. This was the first time that The Undertaker has ever been acknowledged on the network, or really, I think, on any WWE TV show that I can recall, by his real name, Mark Calloway. They were openly just calling him by his real name. Austin asked, whose decision was it for the streak to end at WrestleMania? And Vince said, no one wants to give back to the business more than Mark Calloway. And after beating around the bush for a little bit, Austin pushed him on it. He pushed him on whose call it was. He says, come on, dude, you can't tell me that was Taker's decision to lose that match. And Vince finally admitted it was my call. Undertaker went along with it, but it was Vince's decision. He said the timing was right, and when you look down the road a year, 2 years, who else could work with Undertaker? Who else could he work with? Who else could potentially end the streak? He said there was nobody else. And that'll open a whole other conversation with some people, because you could say, well, why not a Roman Reigns? Why not a Bray Wyatt or somebody new? There's, plenty of other people on the roster. That's another slap in the face of the younger guys. I don't want to jump in on this just because I don't think the streak should have ended. I think given that it did end, it ended the best way that it possibly could, getting Brock over as this unstoppable monster en route to the championship and beating Cena the way he did at SummerSlam. So at least they handled it well. It's not like his first pay-per-view after WrestleMania, they beat Brock. They had Cena beat Brock. At least not yet. He might at the Royal Rumble, but he hasn't yet. So it is what it is. But I was one of those people, like many, who just never thought the streak should be broken in the first place. Austin asks him, why isn't Brock Lesnar around more often? Vince says his contract only allows for them to use him for a certain number of dates each year. And that may be true, but nothing is stopping them from airing videos and vignettes with him on television every now and then. I'm not saying you have to do it every single week, but there's a lot of Brock Lesnar backlash out there. This is the worst. I get a lot of emails asking me, is this the worst championship reign of all time? And I just point people out to the great Khali. Yes, Khali was more active at least, but Khali sucked. And Khali never should have been champion in the first place. Brock Lesnar is this world-class athlete. He's a great character. I mean, the Brock Lesnar character, this prick character that he plays is just so freaking awesome. And the whole package with him and Heyman. So yeah, he's not on television. That kind of sucks. But even so, I wouldn't call it the worst title reign of all time. I wouldn't go that far. Have I been disappointed by it? Yeah. I thought that they would give him one or two opponents between SummerSlam and the Rumble to kind of steamroll over before he gets into the Rumble match and then whoever he's going to wrestle at Mania, whether it's Roman Reigns or whoever. And they didn't do that. Even something like Lesnar and Sheamus. And Sheamus, to me, is not the most exciting character on the roster. I actually find him kind of dull for the most part of late. And he's a really good wrestler. He generally has really good matches. It's just a dead character. I mean, if anybody was overdue for a heel turn, it's Sheamus. But, I kind of warmed to the idea of maybe on a B show doing Lesnar-Sheamus as a championship match, maybe part of a double main event on a card. It would be something different. It would be a fresh opponent for Lesnar. It would be another big guy in there. They'd beat the crap out of each other. Anything. I mean, you could find Randy Orton. I wish they were doing Orton and Lesnar at the Royal Rumble. I am sick to fucking death of Brock Lesnar and John Cena. Enough already. To me, Randy Orton and Brock Lesnar would have been a far more appealing main event for the Royal Rumble, especially with Orton now kind of turning babyface or tweener, whatever he'll be doing when he gets back. But they just keep going back to the same old recycled shit. So in that respect, I've been disappointed in the way they haven't booked Brock. Fact is, I'm sure they could have Brock whenever they want. All they have to do is pay him some more, and they don't want to pay him. But the one thing you can do with him and not really have to worry about paying him so much money because he's not there, you can't tell me that you can't send a camera crew to his home like UFC did once. So I'm sure he'd be willing to do it one time. Send a camera to his home in the woods of Minnesota or Canada. I think he's living in Canada these days. And film some vignettes of him on, hunting, or him with a fucking moose head on the wall, smiling. You just want to punch his face in. Brock Lesnar having a nice meal at a steakhouse somewhere with Paul Heyman, and there's the title sitting there, and they're just gloating, hey, I'm the champ, I'm living like a king. Or show him training. Anything. Come up with some ideas. You mean to tell me that with their army of writers, they can't send a camera crew to wherever the hell Brock is? Send him to a fake house, for fuck's sake, if Brock doesn't want to do anything at his own house. They can do whatever they want to. They choose not to. Brock Lesnar can have a presence on this show a couple of times a month. They choose not to. That's not Brock Lesnar's fault. I don't blame Brock for that. That's their fault. There's no excuse for that. Going into the interview, there were two things I was hoping that Austin would bring up, and that was CM Punk and Randy Savage. He brought up CM Punk. They actually talked about it more than I thought they would, to their credit. And then came Randy Savage, and Austin brought it up. You could tell Austin was kind of uneasy about even mentioning Savage's name. But he brought him up, and he says, will Macho Man be going into the Hall of Fame? He put Vince on the spot. Vince said, absolutely. Absolutely. The Macho Man will be in the WWE Hall of Fame. And Austin pressed him on when. He said soon. Maybe not next year, but soon. And then Austin pressed him one last time for confirmation. Did I hear what I just hear? I want to hear it from you one more time. And Vince says yes. He's going into the Hall of Fame. So there you have it. Randy Savage is going in, and he won't say it, but I think he's going in next year. We just had the new DVD documentary for him that came out, which is actually very good. I think there's a lot of buzz around it. They have some kind of working relationship, obviously, with Lanny Poffo. I don't know how that whole thing is or was resolved, if it was, but I think he's going in next year. I really wish Austin would have at least asked Vince why it's taken so long and why we never saw Savage come back like everybody else, like Hogan, like Warrior, like Brett, like Bruno. Why not Savage? And he didn't go there. I wish he would have. Vince could have just refused to answer, but he never asked the question, so that still lingers. And I said this too, I watched the DVD that they just put out for Randy Savage, and it's very good, and they have, one of the chapters in the documentary it's brief, but it's devoted to his departure. And they actually aired the footage of McMahon on Raw, and it's such a weird thing to watch. You can find it on YouTube. It's just so weird to see Vince McMahon, the announcer, sitting there, openly acknowledging that, we couldn't come to a contractual agreement with Randy Savage, and Randy, I wish you nothing but the best, Godspeed. I mean, when was the last time you saw Vince McMahon give somebody who basically left the company, although this was before he went to WCW. Had he known he was going to WCW, he may not have said that. But when was the last time you can remember seeing or hearing Vince McMahon say anything like that about somebody on television? It was such a weird thing, and maybe it was more just betrayal. Maybe it was business. Maybe there was something to the rumors of Stephanie McMahon and Randy Savage. Clearly, they were selling this DVD, in part, off of those rumors. They never explicitly came out and said what the rumor was, but they definitely danced around it. They definitely alluded to it. They had Dusty Rhodes on there saying, I forgot exactly how he phrased it, but like, only God knows. We'll never know. It's so obvious what they were doing on that DVD. It's so disingenuous. And to me, the way I look at it is this. The inference with this rumor that's been around for years and years and years is that Randy Savage had some kind of sexual relationship or sexual relations with an underage Stephanie McMahon before he left the company, and Vince McMahon didn't find out about it until many years later. Is it true? Is it not true? Is it some bullshit rumor that was started 14 years ago on an internet bulletin board? Or is there some truth to it? Because you hear Savage's own brother, Lanny Poffo, in interviews. It's not like he comes out and says, it's nonsense. They're sullying my brother's name. And he's very, very defensive in the documentary about Randy. Like, he's always defending him from these awful things people say about how he used to treat Elizabeth and he would lock her in her dressing room. He's very defensive about that. But in other interviews, when he gets asked about the whole Savage-Stephanie rumor, he's like, you'd have to ask Randy. I don't know. And like, just the way he answers it, it's very, very odd. And so it makes you wonder. And to me, if this is a bullshit rumor, then this should have been debunked probably a long time ago. But on this DVD, there was not one single comment from any member of the McMahon family. Nothing from Vince, nothing from Stephanie, nothing from Hunter, none of them. Almost every single documentary they've done for one of their big stars has Triple H, has Vince McMahon on there. None of them were on there for Savage. They contributed nothing to the comments on this DVD. If this was not true, if this was some salacious BS rumor that got started on the internet or got started by Savage, who knows, then Vince or Stephanie herself should have been on that DVD saying, there's been a lot of really horrible things that have been said and rumors on the internet. None of it's true. Just come out and squash it and put it to bed. Because otherwise, you leave this lingering out there. I mean, think about what this rumor is about. This guy is like a pedophile. He had sex with an underage girl. That's a fucking awful thing. And so now you're kind of leaving it suspended out there because you're not saying anything about it. You're not denying it. All that's going to do is make people think, maybe there's something to it. So I was kind of hoping there'd be some kind of closure and he would ask him the question. He didn't push on it. And so it still lingers. The question still lingers. And there's always going to be that doubt. And it's this little cloud in a way that kind of hangs over Randy Savage. And I'm a big fan of Savage. It would suck to find out that something like that were true. And as long as they don't say anything about it, because Savage can't defend himself, if Vince and Stephanie don't say anything, then we're never going to know. And I think that's pretty shitty, because if they know it's not true, just come out and say it. And every time they don't, it makes me wonder. But at least we know Savage is going to go into the Hall of Fame, and the only thing I have to say about that is this. It'll be well-deserved when he goes in, but bittersweet, because he really should have been there to give his own speech. At that point, I was trying to think of things like Austin. What could he ask? Like, he's already talked about Punk. He's talked about Shane McMahon, Randy Savage, like all these things that you would want somebody to ask Vince McMahon, because he never does an interview like this. And so I'm like thinking to myself, like, ask him what was in the briefcase that he carried into the police station with him when he met with the cops after Jimmy Snuka's girlfriend was found dead, you know? And then Snuka got away with it. Now, there's a question I would love to know the answer to. And actually, I don't think she was found dead. I think she was still alive and then died at the hospital. That's a whole sordid story unto itself. On Sting. Sting's name came up. Vince says he would not be surprised to see him at WrestleMania. No real surprise there. We've all been expecting it, and I think Survivor Series all but confirmed that he would be at WrestleMania. Got into Vince's national expansion and killing off the territories. Vince says he wanted to buy the AWA, but Vern Gagne refused to sell to him. And while all of the other promoters were resting on their laurels in their little studios, Vince was reinvesting his money back into the production. He said Bill Watts was the only promoter who really fought back. He was really in denial that he had any responsibility in putting the territories out of business. He says they put themselves out of business. Basically, the territories screwed the territories. Now, I will say he's not entirely wrong. A lot of them didn't want to grow. They didn't want to change with the times. They likely would have died out anyway. Vince saw where things were going, and he made the first move. He's still around. They're not. But I would say just really read up on some of the things he did, like going into certain markets and paying the local TV stations to run WWF tapes and stop running the local promotion shows and stuff like that. Really sneaky shit that I guess was smart of him to do, but to imply that he had nothing to do with it is being a bit disingenuous. Jim Ross, another very interesting topic brought up during this interview. Vince McMahon claims he has no heat with JR, likes him as a human being. You know, this no heat thing. Look, Austin's doing a podcast with Vince McMahon. A lot of WWE guys are allowed to go on Steve Austin's podcast. He just had Bray Wyatt on. Chris Jericho gets WWE people left and right. I think this week he's got Sami Zayn and Adrian Neville from NXT on his show. And yes, Jericho is a part-time performer still for them. He comes and goes. Austin doesn't wrestle anymore. Austin doesn't really have any sort of consistent working relationship that I think anybody is aware of. And Jim Ross actually does, because WWE Shop sells his products. They still sell JR's barbecue sauce and mustard and ketchup and all that stuff. So even JR still has some kind of business relationship with WWE. So I'm left to wonder, if there's no heat with Jim Ross, then why is Jim Ross the only person? And he's gone on Twitter and has stated that there is a ban on WWE's part in allowing any of their talent to go on his show. They can go on Jericho's show. They can go on Austin's show. Not his. There must be heat somewhere. It's Vince's company, last I checked. So I don't buy that either. He didn't want to get into it, but he did say there was an incident with JR in Los Angeles. That was the now infamous video game panel at SummerSlam last year, where people thought Jim Ross was drunk as the moderator. He claims he wasn't. He has Bell's palsy. He was very tired, so he was slurring his speech, and he says people mistook that for him being drunk. And Ric Flair got all emotional talking about his son Reed, who had died of a drug overdose earlier that year. Probably had no business being out there in that setting, to be honest with you. He said Jim Ross acted unprofessionally, which is ridiculous, given that it was Flair who was making a scene, and he got punished too, and they ended up hiring Flair back, but not Jim Ross. Then we delved a little bit deeper into things, and this is what I found really interesting. Vince brought up Jim Ross moving from Connecticut back to Oklahoma, which is something that happened like a decade ago. I think when JR was still doing talent relations stuff, or maybe it was around the time that John Laurinaitis was taking over. He decided he wanted to go back to Oklahoma. He didn't want to stay in Stamford anymore. He was still going to work for them, but he wanted to go back home. So he moved to Oklahoma. And with Vince McMahon, that's a big deal, because you are expected to move to Stamford no matter where you are. You got to move to Connecticut. That's where Titan Tower is. That's where the home base is. All hands on deck kind of thing. And apparently this was like a great affront, a great offense to Vince McMahon that JR, he took his ball and went home. Because Vince brought this up Clearly it still gnaws at him. Clearly it still bothers him. You got the impression that Vince never forgot about that, even though it was years ago, and he took it as JR not being a team player. He didn't say that in those words, but he may as well have. He said you can't half-ass the job. It's a 24/7 gig. He said JR was the one who decided to take it easy and didn't want to work 7 days a week. You have to be all in, he says. So now I think we see where at least some of that heat likely comes from, at least from Vince's end. Again, you can't tell me that there's not something there. All the times they embarrass this guy on television, all the times that Jim Ross wasn't even working for them anymore, and they have the announcers go ahead and they mock him in the commentary whenever they're in Oklahoma, all the stuff they do, it's all from Vince. And you're going to tell me that Vince doesn't have any sort of problem with Jim Ross? You're full of shit. So I found this, what Vince said himself, what he brought up, very, very insightful, I think, into the whole Vince McMahon, Jim Ross dynamic. And I'm very curious to see what JR's reaction to all this is as well. At that point, Austin said, well, we got 20 seconds left. And Vince McMahon says, I own the damn network. Let's keep it going 15 more minutes. I pop big for that. Vince adamantly denies that he is out of touch and says he listens to his audience. Vince does comedy better than John Cena does. That was a good one. By the way, to the people who want to bring up the reactions that John Cena has been getting for the last 9 years as proof that Vince McMahon doesn't listen to his audience, I mean, there's a lot of different things you can point to mock him when he says that. I actually would not use that one. I will defend Vince McMahon on that in this respect. People may boo the guy everywhere he goes, but they're still buying tickets to the live events with him headlining. More than they're buying tickets to the ones that don't have him on there. Like when they do those split crew house shows, there's like a John Cena crew, and before he got hurt, there was a Daniel Bryan crew. The Cena crew would routinely outdraw the Bryan crew. And same goes for Roman Reigns or whoever else, Randy Orton, that they would have headlining in a particular city. The Cena shows always outdrew them, always sold more tickets. And his segments still do better numbers than most. And people buy his merchandise like it's going out of style. They buy his stuff more than anybody else's. Now, granted, it helps when the company makes 24 shirts a month for you in every fucking color in the crayon box, but still. You want that to change? Stop buying tickets to his house shows. Stop buying his merchandise. The fans are every bit as responsible for the Cena era that they claim they're so sick and tired of as Vince McMahon is. And I know a lot of people listening to this right now, they don't buy John Cena merchandise. They don't like John Cena. And if it was up to them, they wouldn't buy a ticket specifically to see John Cena perform. But there are plenty of people who do. Blame it on them. If they stop buying tickets and they stop buying those t-shirts, I bet you things would change pretty quick. So I can't even really fault Vince too much for that, because the fans deserve as much blame as he does. Then Austin brought up their cage match, Austin and Vince at the St. Valentine's Day Massacre show back in '99. That was where Vince took that sick bump off the side of the steel cage. He landed on the edge of the announce table, his neck whiplashed. He looked like he was just laying there dead when it was over. They talked about the WrestleMania 13 double turn with Bret Hart and Steve Austin. Austin getting color in the match. I mean, it was wild to be watching this with Vince on the network. And Austin, even Vince at one point, he's talking about baby faces and heels and Mark Calloway. And there's Austin talking like he does on every single one of his podcasts, talking about, you know, getting color and getting the heat and using all the wrestling lingo. It was just very weird to see this on, you know, television with the WWE logo in the corner of the screen. It was nice. I mean, I said a long time ago, one thing I could never figure out, and it might be something worth considering because they can make some money off of it. And, you know, we talked before about the territories and putting them out of business. You know, they could really give a lot of these companies like Kayfabe Commentaries, which does a great job, and RF Video, you know, they're known for their shoots. If WWE wanted to go into the shoot business and have shoot videos that they themselves produce, they can get probably anybody they wanted to, number one, because it's WWE, and I'm sure they pay well, so they can get shoot interviews with God knows who, and they could probably make a fortune off of it, and then you can air them on the network. I mean, they could really make some money off that if they ever wanted to get into that business. But they talked about the WrestleMania 13 match and how Austin bled. At that time, there was also a no-blood policy like there is today. And what was Vince's reaction? Was he pissed off? And of course, Vince gave kind of a corporate generic answer where, I'm sure I wasn't happy, but I could tell that the fans were into it, and so you got to listen to your audience. And as they wrap things up, Vince made a comment saying that he's open to feedback. They got back on this discussion about creative and how things can change and listening to the audience, and Vince is like, I'm always open to feedback. And then he, 20 seconds later, ends up saying, well, I don't listen to my critics. He ignores his critics. I'm open to feedback, but I don't want to hear from people who don't like what I'm doing. That was kind of weird, and actually very sobering to hear him admit that. Not that anybody likes to be criticized, but I would hope he is at least open to constructive criticism. I think that's one of the problems, and you hear about this with Vince and even other executives and other wrestling companies, other companies in general. You surround yourself with yes men. So these people want to keep their jobs, they want to keep the boss happy, and they tell him what he wants to hear. I mean, we hear stories like this all the time from people, even ex-writers who worked for WWE in the past. And again, people walk around on eggshells, not just the wrestlers, but the writers and the employees. They don't want to piss off Vince and incur his wrath and lose their job. So they're going to tell him what he wants to hear. And Vince likes toilet humor. So when we see these comedy segments that aren't funny and they're actually disgusting, and they're not funny to anybody except Vince McMahon, they're being scripted on purpose that way because people think that's what Vince wants to see. It doesn't matter what the audience wants, even though that's what he's saying in this interview. And that's one of the funnier things he said all night. It's what entertains him. We've heard plenty of stories from people like that before. And so at the very end, Austin wants to know, they're running out of time, and he's like, how can the fans voice their opinion to you? And I think Vince was going to give an answer about, we listen to the crowds at the buildings or something, but Austin's like, is there an email address? And then he remembered that Vince has a Twitter, even though I doubt it's Vince who actually tweets, but he's got a Twitter account. And he tells the fans, why don't you tweet Vince McMahon with what you want to see? And you have to see the exasperated expression on Vince's face when Austin mentions his Twitter. Just the idea, hey, everybody, why don't you tweet Vince McMahon your displeasure? Why don't you tweet him everything that you want to see in the product, everything you want to see on TV? It was just, looking at Vince's reaction, it was hilarious. I wanted to strangle Austin at that point. And then they wrapped it up. I think overall it was fun. We can pick apart Vince's answers like I did here because there's a lot to pick apart. I think some of the more offensive stuff was more at the beginning when he made those comments about the millennials and the roster and Cesaro. I mean, he made some really, I think, bogus comments. I mean, he may believe it, but I think that's bullshit. And again, everybody will have an opinion on the different things that he said. You could pick apart his answers. But he sat in the hot seat. Didn't have to do that. Didn't have to give Austin an extra 15 minutes either. He seemed to be getting into it as it went on. And it made for must-see television. So I say again, I hope they continue this trend. Whether it's with Austin or they bring in somebody else, this should not be the one and only podcast on the network or shoot interview, call it whatever you want to, that they do. This should be the first in a series. And I'm not saying that it should be every week. I don't know. Maybe once a month, maybe a couple of times a year. They have 4 NXT specials spread out throughout the year. Maybe you do 3 or 4 per year. But I hope they do more because this was must-see TV. It's exactly what the network should have. The network should have more stuff like this. And now all we have to do is get Triple H in the hot seat next and watch the network subscriber numbers skyrocket. Get Undertaker in there too. That would be fascinating. Austin did say that he had a conversation with Undertaker months ago before WrestleMania 30. And Undertaker agreed to do his show. And then Undertaker lost at WrestleMania, and there was some rumors that he was hurt. He was dealing with some injuries. And I guess Austin hasn't really talked to him since. And Austin says, I haven't heard from him. But he agreed to, at one point, do an interview. If he's game, why not do it on the network? Steve Austin sits down with The Undertaker, Mark Calloway for a shoot interview. That'd be pretty cool. So hopefully you enjoyed this review. I would suggest you check out the interview yourself because you got to see Vince's facial reactions. Austin's going to have the audio of the interview up on Podcast One next week if you want to download the MP3 or stream it. And I hope you enjoyed this review. We have more reviews like this on the YouTube channel as Sound Off Extras. They're bonus content. The full episodes of the podcast you can listen to every Sunday they drop thesolomonster.com is the website address. You can also subscribe in iTunes, Stitcher Radio. We're on TuneIn Radio. We're on a lot of different services, so it's not hard to find the Sound Off. And check it out. I think you might like it. Follow me on Twitter, @Solomonster, and please hit the subscribe button right now that you see in the video, so that way when new videos like this are posted, you will be alerted as to what they are and when they go up. We have a full episode of the Sound Off, number 356, covering all the CM Punk stuff that he talked about. I just posted a review of Chris Jericho's third book that I just got finished with, a great read, so you can find that elsewhere on the channel. I did a review of the Bret Hart Kayfabe Commentaries 1992 timeline shoot, which if you were a fan of WWF back in the day, in the 80s, early 90s, that is fascinating. And Bret has a lot of great stories. You'll find a lot of stuff on the YouTube channel here, so please subscribe. And that about wraps it up here. So thank you for listening. Until next time, be well, stay safe, and we will be back very soon with another Sound Off Extra. Until then, take care, guys.